Okay, let's go ahead and start in the interest of time.
Great.
Today we have Dr. Joseph Houpt. He's an associate professor of psychology at UTSA, and his research interests are in investigating human performance, perception, and cognition through mathematical modeling. And he's particularly interested in research at the intersection of psychology and AI, including using machine learning to better understand human cognition and in the psychology underlying human-AI interaction. Dr. Houpt received his PhD in 2012 from Indiana University, and he has since then published in several journals and also book chapters. And his work is funded by the National Science Foundation and Air Force Office of Scientific Research. Let us give a warm welcome to Dr. Houpt, and looking forward to listening to your talk.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to present to this group. I've sort of get to present these ideas in psychology groups quite a bit, so it's kind of nice to have a different perspective as well. Also wanted to put out a disclaimer. A lot of this is kind of first round of presenting this material, so I apologize for some of the slides being a little bit raw. Oops, there we go. So this is the excitement of using Wikimedia to come up with a representation of AI and of cognitions. We've got HAL and then some old print of what psychology might be. But like was mentioned in the introduction, my interests really are in how we can facilitate the crosstalk between artificial intelligence, machine learning, and psychology. And I think a lot of people are familiar with this kind of back and forth and the opportunities that involved, including cognition and human cognition inspiring algorithms and architectures for computer systems. Another interest of mine is in improved interfaces. So the better we understand human cognition, the better we can interface with artificial systems and machine learning systems. That's kind of at the individual level, but that scales up into much more complicated systems where we have AI systems in concert with groups of people interacting over technology and things like that as well. Likewise, there's a lot of exciting opportunities to use some of these new methods coming out for understanding human cognition as well. I probably would reorder these for importance, but I may as well stick with the bullets the way I typed them in. One is modeling the information available for a task. So if any of you in the audience are familiar with ideal observer analysis, the approach here is to try and have a model of the information available to a person for a given task, and then use that as a foundation on which to understand how cognition uses that information. And by having more complicated algorithms able to do more complicated tasks, we can get a better idea of what information is available based on how they perform. And I'll give an example of that a little bit later. Certainly data analysis is another opportunity. So with many questions in studying human cognition, our hypotheses don't fit very well into the classic box of a regression analysis or ANOVA. And so having more complicated data analysis tools available allows us to ask deeper questions about these processes. And then finally, kind of the inverse of the inspiration for algorithms and architectures is that there's a lot of opportunity for inspiration for how we understand human cognition from how these machine systems work. And then probably should be a separate point, but kind of related to data analysis. A lot of new tools available as well for assessing models that can be helpful in validating our cognitive models against how people perform tasks. So the way I approach this, kind of from my background, is from the subfield mathematical psychology. For those of you that aren't familiar with this subfield, mathematical psychologists, this is from a quote from I think an encyclopedia article on MathPsych. But really the concern is primarily developing theories and models of behavior that permit quantitative prediction of behavioral change under varying experimental conditions. So our interests really are in human cognition and psychological processes, but we want to approach that using formal models that have quantitative predictions. And I'll come back to this theme a couple times, but I really see this, this subfield of psychology as offering a bridge between the more computer science and engineering worldview on cognition and the psychology approaches. Just to give you a flavor of some of the themes that come up, these are a couple titles of recent articles from the journal that should have some pretty familiar terminology to those in the AI world as well. So curriculum spaces and mathematical models for curriculum design, comparing Bayesian models for simultaneity judgment with different causal assumptions. And then this third one, it's not a paper I was involved with, but does kind of relate to a later theme in the talk. Decisions with multiple alternatives, geometric models, and higher dimensions. If you are interested, that's the society website, mathpsych.org, and there are two journals from the society, the Journal of Mathematical Psychology and Computational Brain and Behavior. So transitioning a bit then into examples of how I've done some of the work at this intersection. This first one is research we've done looking at interaction with recommender systems. Real simple task here. They just see a bar on the screen and have to decide if it's short enough to attempt production, whatever that is, or if it's too long and the material should be thrown out. The idea here is that there's a human making a perceptual judgment, and then they get a recommendation from a system that has access to some other information about the material. Now, we were interested in comparing two types of perceptual cues. The one represented on the top here, the recommender system just imposes color on the bar to indicate its recommendation. The reason we chose color here is that color and shape are what we sort of think of as separable perceptual dimensions, meaning people are fairly good at focusing their attention on one of those aspects or another. So fairly good at, say, just noticing the blueness of the bar or just the length of the bar. And there's not a lot of influence of one of those on the other in the perceptual system. Contrast that with a system where we sort of force people to deal with the recommender system, so that the lower figure here is the version of the task where we indicated the recommendation from the other system using the width of the bar. So in this case, these are non-separable dimensions. So the width of the bar does influence our perception of the length of the bar. And so our question was, in a situation where this recommender system is actually very helpful, it's kind of a difficult length judgment task, it's noisy, and the recommender system is very accurate, something like 95 or 96%. So generally speaking, it's a good idea to take that information into account. If we're kind of perceptually forcing people to do it, do they get more efficient in the system? And it actually turns out people get much worse. So there's probably more to explore in terms of why people are resisting the information from the recommender system or what's going on there. But people are actually much more efficient with this top system where we keep the recommendation separable than this lower system where we force them to pay attention to it. This is a fairly simple setup for the system, but we were using this kind of system, collaborating with somebody that works in surface transportation and like automated braking types of systems. And so we're looking at how these types of results might better inform how we have those kinds of interactions in more complex environments. I had to throw in some eye tracking. So this is an example about how more recently developed machine learning methods can be useful in trying to extract information from our data. So in this particular task, the data were collected in Germany. The participant is given an animal and then asked to categorize what type of animal. So Strauss, I think, is an ostrich, and a Säugetier is a mammal, and Vogel is a bird. So the idea here is that Strauss is an atypical bird, spends most of its time on the ground. And so we might want to compare that to a typical bird if we put a pigeon in there as the target word. And so to give you a flavor of the data here, this X and Y plane down here are visual angle on the screen, and then Z is the time axis. We've got two different traces here. One is the eye tracking trace, that's here with the circles. And then the second trace is their mouse cursor, so kind of tracking where they move the cursor over time. The colors here are from an unsupervised learning system. It's a hierarchical Bayesian model. The highest level, it generates the number of discrete categories. Next level down is a Markov model for transition between categories. And then at the lowest level, it goes from that discrete state space to the observed continuous path movements. And so what it does for us, so it pulled out things like fixations, and saccades in the eye movement. And then likewise in the mouse movement, the colors probably could be mapped better, but the mouse movement, it's got where the mouse is steady, a quick movement, a corrective movement, and then another holding the mouse steady. And then from these type of data, we can pull out sort of more discrete representations of what a person might have been doing in this task. So for example, they read the target word, they look to the right-hand category. Already they know that a Strauss is a Fogel, so they move their mouse over and make a corrective movement. Before choosing no, they just double check to make sure there might not be a better category over here. So they look over to the alternative category, read it, and then move their eye back to actually make the selection. And so using these machine learning methods, we're able to take this data, boil it down to a more manageable description in terms of the discrete states of the eye and the mouse to be able to then map it on what's potentially going on in cognition, and then compare that to the types of things that happen with more typical stimuli. This third one, I couldn't find great figures of the model, but this is an example of that ideal observer type analysis. So, you know, and ultimately the graphs just aren't all that useful here without spending 20 minutes describing them. But the rough idea is that there's a fairly robust effect in visual search based on the type of distractors in the environment, fairly simplistic environments, where depending on the frequency of different types of distractors, you get this kind of U-shaped curve of the number of fixations when looking for a target. And a lot of the models of visual search sort of put that U-shaped curve on the visual system. So properties of the way our visual system works. And we were able to show with a visual search model that was essentially optimal, except that it has a foveated system. So higher acuity where it has some attentional focus and lower acuity in the periphery. This particular case, I always mix up what UCT stands for, but essentially it was a brute force search for where to look, but we did some nice tree trimming to make it a little more efficient. And we recovered that shape of the curve. So what this did is it really demonstrates that the pattern of performance here is driven by the way the information is structured in the environment. And it's not necessarily some innate property of the way visual search works. All right, so that's a flavor of a couple of those different kinds of examples, the back and forth between AI, machine learning, and cognitive modeling. I'm going to drill down to some more recent work, but starting with some older models of how people do categorization, how people take a new exemplar and respond with a particular category. The first bit of background is multidimensional scaling. This seems to have had kind of a resurgence recently, so I think many of you may already be familiar with it, mostly used as a visualization technique. The main idea of multidimensional scaling is you take relationships among sort of items, in psychology it's usually stimuli or categories, and try and take those relationships and map them into some spatial representation. So for example, this is data from an undergraduate psychology class a little while ago, where we just had people had these students, they just, rate the similarity between pairs of colors. And importantly for the next slide, if you do much in color, this is just varying on hues. So we have a constant brightness and saturation of these colors. So what multidimensional scaling does is it takes these pairwise similarities and uses that information to get a spatial representation. And so if you're familiar with the color wheel, this is one way that you can kind of recover that information. So we've got, based on those similarities, we see the numbers of violet and blue and azure very close together. Sorry about the misspelling of chartreuse. I should eventually fix that, but it's in a figure, so it's more work. But you see this kind of spatial representation of those data. Colors already have kind of a natural spatial representation, whether it's RGB or CIE or something. But this type of approach is very general. You don't have to have things that have a natural spatial representation. So for example, the next experiment we did in that class was with donuts. And so they had, looked at pairwise similarities of donuts and were able to recover a spatial representation of how people judge the similarity of donuts. So we see that, blueberry and jelly-filled donuts were quite similar. We have kind of the spicy donuts down here, these kind of plain donuts, butter twist, glazed, sour cream, and pretzel. And then this other cluster of donuts over here that are maybe the more rich donuts, custard-filled and cream-filled and chocolate. So that's kind of roughly the goal of multidimensional scaling. Take something that may not have a spatial representation, use how people treat them in perception to map onto a spatial representation. And then, helpful for visualization, but it can also be used in terms of understanding how people make categories decisions as well. So just briefly, the kind of core algorithm of the classical style of multidimensional scaling is that you have some observed dissimilarity, so relationship between the stimuli or items. And then you put the points down in the space. So the xi and xj would be points in the space. And you want the distances between those points to be kind of close to the whatever your measured dissimilarity of the original things are. And then you can use sort of whatever your favorite minimization algorithm is to move the points around in the space to try and get a good solution here. And there's lots of sort of good technical argument or algorithms out there for doing this. And then there's also some more modern versions of this approach. So this is essentially I think it was 1950s or 60s approach I'm describing here. I'll talk a little bit about Isomap a little bit later, which is a relatively more recent version of this type of thing. It's also kind of similar to principal components analysis in the sense that we've got some high dimensional data here. We could treat this azure as a vector in similarity space and then do a PCA on it to reduce it to someplace in 2 dimensions. It is fairly closely related to a version of PCA, kernel PCA, where rather than the standard PCA, you're projecting down onto eigenvectors, and kernel PCA sort of a different way of choosing those projected bases. But otherwise, there's an equivalence there. Okay, so that's the background. The first kind of full categorization model I'll talk about is this generalized context model from Robert Nosofsky's work. The idea here was to take a verbal theory of how people deal with categories, exemplar theory, and then encode it in something mathematical so that we had quantitative predictions. And then I'll briefly comment on the fact that it is very closely related to machine learning approaches for categorization as well. So the exemplar theory verbally is that any exemplar of a category I've seen, I'm going to store it. And then when I have a new stimuli, I basically look at the collection of all the exemplars in whichever collection on average I'm closest to or something like that, then I'll categorize it with that one. So for example, if I've got to categorize an ostrich and I have to decide whether it's a bird or a mammal, I'll take that ostrich and compare it against all the other stored representations of birds that have been trained on in the past, and compare that to all the other stored representations of mammals in the past. And if the ostrich is closer to all those birds, I'll say bird. If it's closer to all those mammals, I'll say mammal. What we need for this type of thing quantitatively, though, is to have a number associated with that distance. And so the generalized context model uses the MDS approach to map from generally talking about similarity of animals, where we may not have a spatial representation a priori, into this MDS space, where now we have distances, usually Euclidean distances, or they also use city block distance in this model as well. And then that gives us those distances on which to base categorization decisions. So this is kind of written out in equation form, but the basic idea is there's the sum similarity between the ostrich and all the birds, a bias parameter. So if I just like to call things birds in general, even if the ostrich is maybe a little closer to mammals, if I'm biased towards saying birds, that parameter can be included in the model. So that's the generalized context model of categorization. It's a hugely influential model in terms of how people in psychology and cognitive modeling view categorization. And it's got this nice clean mapping onto essentially nearest neighbors method with this additional bias parameter. So dimensionality reduction and then nearest neighbors. Part of the reason I want to highlight this is because I think when we talk about that crosstalk, so being able to communicate the results of a machine learning system, or to have an AI system understand how a person have some model of how a person approaches data to be able to better communicate results. It's nice to have these kinds of mappings. So again, having a nearest neighbors methods with some weight parameters as an internal representation in an AI system of what a human is saying actually gets pretty close to a fairly well-respected model of what psychologists view people are actually doing with making categorization decisions. And just a recent example of how this model has been used. So Nosovsky has been looking at how experts and novices categorize images of rocks to get a sense of how how novices are missing particular dimensions or concentrating on kind of chimera dimensions and classifying these rocks. So this is a three-dimensional solution here. The sphere, I guess, volumes indicate the bias. So for example, and looking at the similarities, obsidian is not often confused with or rated as low similarity to the other rocks. For example, rhyolite here, people are sort of more biased towards categorizing things as rhyolite than gabbro. I don't know anything about rocks, so I could be mispronouncing things and saying kind of absurd things, but at least I can interpret MDS plots. So this could be really valuable in terms of training. So what are the right rocks to show a novice to kind of highlight dimensions that show up in an expert dimension as well. And I'll come back to the training theme later. A sort of competitor model of how people do categorization as general recognition theory is one of these types, proposed originally by Ashby and Townsend in '86 as well. And so this model encodes the view that for categorization, really there's a representation of an average or a distribution of training examples. And then the categorization of new stimuli, rather than being compared to a whole collection, is just compared to that distribution of the training examples, or the distributional representation of training examples. So those two kind of verbal descriptions, exemplar theory and I forgot the keyword for this one, but this average representation theory are kind of represent a long debate in categorization models. Okay, so taking general recognition theory from the verbal model to the quantitative representation, the way they did that is generalizing the signal detection model. if you're familiar with that, to multidimensional classifications. I'll take a little bit of time to walk through this figure just to give you a sense of what this model does. So the core idea here in the figure, each of these A1, B1s would be different stimuli. And the A and B represent two different dimensions of the stimuli. So it could be the length of the bar and the color of the bar. And then these are the subscript here represents the level on that dimension. So if A is length, maybe 1 is short and 2 is long. And if B is color, maybe 1 is yellow and 2 is blue. Now, part of the issue with this model is that if I just look at a single stimulus and talk about its distribution, it's sort of meaningless. I can have any distribution associated with it. It's only meaningful when I talk about it in contrast to other alternatives. So if I wanted to contrast to between the short blue bar and the long blue bar, then I start to get more information out of it. Then the distances between them become meaningful. Even still, that distance between them is only meaningful insofar as sort of the distance between the mean relative to the variance of the distributions. If I want more information about, say, within stimulus relationship across the dimensions or across stimulus relationships, then I can go to this 2x2 space. So looking at the relationship between what happens as I change from yellow to blue when I have a short bar, or yellow to blue when I have a long bar, or when I go from short to long with a blue bar, or short to long with a yellow bar. And once I've got that space, I can recover a lot more information, or I can identify a lot more information about both how things change in terms of distances within the space as I change the stimulus, as well as within a stimulus, getting estimates of effectively correlation between the way we perceive the parts in the categorization. And so in terms of categorization, maybe this is, if this is a subset of the representation of animals, maybe this is the bird mammal distinction criterion. And I have an ostrich over here. If this is an equal likelihood contour, sorry, I sort of skipped the part of saying this is an equal likelihood contour. But there's some probability that when I show that ostrich that it might fall outside this decision bound and end up on the mammal side of things. But for the most part, it's most likely that it's categorized as a bird. So that's kind of a roughly a visual representation of this model. The core pieces I want to take of this, though, is that for a stimulus, we map it into some kind of spatial representation, and that spatial representation also has a probability distribution associated with it. I forgot to fix the case here, but slightly more formally, if I have a stimulus X or a category X, then the perceptual representation is a random variable. In the classic GRT models, that random variable is assumed to have a normal distribution with some mean, so that's sitting in some multidimensional space, and then a covariance matrix in that space as well. And again, I kind of said that, but there's some perceptual process that takes the stimulus and maps it into that perceptual representation space, and there's noise associated with that process. Let's see. I kind of mentioned that the means are sort of relative to an arbitrary origin. What really matters is the distance between the means. So the distance between mammals and birds, or the distance between a short bar and a long bar. And and that distance could be like Mahalanobis distance, in the sense that really what the probability of, say, saying long when it's a short bar, the probability of saying short when it's a long bar. Similarly, the covariances really only matter relative to other covariances. So I can talk about the relationship between width and length in a bar and how those might influence each other perceptually. But to represent that spatially, I need to be able to contrast it with other levels of those dimensions. So I can't just say a fat long bar has correlated width and length. I have to say relative to a short thin bar. And then again, the categorization response can be based on decision bounds, so the probability of crossing a decision bound, or using likelihood ratio types of things, and both versions of these have been used. And so this should look fairly familiar or might look fairly familiar as essentially multivariate logistic regression. So sort of like the generalized context model, there's a fairly close analog that would show up in any machine learning textbook that sort of is a representation of this model that's been built up in psychology for representing categorization. These aren't accidents, so it's not like it's out of the blue that there's a relationship between some of these models, but I think sometimes that close connection isn't highlighted enough. Okay, so that's kind of background material. We've got the GCM and the multidimensional scaling space that it uses, and we've got the generalized recognition theory model that has some sort of space that stimuli sit on and a probability distribution sitting on top of it. To dig in a little bit deeper, I'm going to pull in just a little bit of differential geometry here, mostly to say this if we make some assumptions, we get some really nice stuff that allows us to translate between these models or models of, say, a machine learning model and a human perceptual model, at least have sort of existence proofs of these things, and potentially even have some hints at the right way to get at the types of maps. So the first thing is a manifold. So a manifold is basically some shape in a higher dimensional space. So a canonical example is the shell of a sphere, or the surface of a sphere in R3. And these shapes have some nice properties that allow us to talk about effectively distance or derivatives on those shapes. One way of getting at those nice properties is through these chart maps. So the idea is that up here I've got a manifold, and down here I've just got a Euclidean space. A chart map is basically something that is a nice propertied function that maps between things on the manifold and things in Euclidean space. And for a manifold, I need to have one of these types of things for every point on the manifold. With the additional criteria, if I've got these functions that are defined on a set and that's overlapping with another one, that they should play nice together. And then that gives opportunity for, say, mapping in the Euclidean space between different parts of the manifold to talk about relationships among different parts of the manifold, sort of up in the manifold space. And Euclidean plane is I guess that's kind of redundant. So that's real high level, and I'm definitely not a differential geometer, so I don't know that I could give you much more depth, but hopefully it's enough that when I'm throwing these terms around in the next couple of slides, it's not entirely without context. The other piece here is really just that if we've got nice properties on the manifolds, we can also talk about relating derivatives on one manifold to derivatives on another manifold, these push forward functions. And that'll be useful because the derivatives really relate in perception to kind of changes on perceptual dimensions. And so later we'll talk a little bit about trying to relate what happens as I change the stimulus to, say, a human perceptual system, relating it to what happens as I change a stimulus in, say, a machine vision system. So that we have manifolds means we have some nice tools that we can use. Okay, so digging in a little bit more with the differential geometry, this Isomap is a not new, but more recent version of multidimensional scaling, where rather than kind of assuming everything that fits nicely in Euclidean space, it first takes this idea that the information really might be sitting on a manifold, and tries to calculate the distances preserving that manifold structure and then give the spatial representation. The algorithm is relatively straightforward. So you take a point and then you take the things around it So, if I took Azure, I might take blue and magenta, create a graph of the data where edges in that graph are weighted based on how far away they are in the space. And then kind of moving that window around gives you a collection of graphs that are connected. Using that connected subgraphs, finding the shortest paths gives you a way to talk about distance, not just from things that kind of happen in that little bubble, but all the way around the manifold. Once those distances are created for everything, then it's embedded in a Euclidean space for visualization. The core idea here, though, is that rather than talking about the distance from red to green, where I'd be sort of jumping through the middle of hue space, where when I pretend that hue is the only thing that varies, there really isn't anything there. This Isomap approach sort of preserves the fact that to get from red to green, really, you kind of have to go around the color wheel. I've got the donuts up here, because I don't have a strong understanding of what donut perceptual space should be. I'm not sure if there is like a donut manifold here or not, but in theory, there could be some U-shaped manifold where really blueberry is not directly comparable to custard filled. You have to kind of talk about the distance between blueberry and custard filled as the distance between blueberry and the kind of plain donuts, and then back around to this other side of the custard filled donuts. So the core idea here, though, is that Isomap, rather than kind of treating everything as flat and Euclidean for these types of multidimensional situation, starts with the assumption that what's really out there might be better represented on a Riemannian manifold. And so just to kind of put it out there, generalization of the generalized context model, so GCM, might be to move away from relying on the multidimensional scaling space with either a Euclidean or city block metric, and move to a space where we might be able to allow for more complicated collections of objects that may be sitting on a more complicated manifold and not just a flat space. And then using those distances in terms of calculating, or the exemplar is sitting on a manifold and talking about distances on that manifold for categorization rather than sort of treating everything as flat. And then again, it does allow for this back and forth correspondence between the machine learning models and the model of a human perceptual representation. You can play similar games trying to generalize GRT models, so a GGRT model, just stack Gs. This comes from this idea of those sort of patches and chart maps that we have for differential geometry. So in the GRT model, I was talking about mapping from the stimulus to some perceptual representation space. So let's assume that that perceptual representation is sitting on a manifold. And then what we can do is kind of walk around in terms of our experiments and measure that relationship between stimulus and perceptual space at various points. And as long as we can, get that mapping and it satisfies the properties of diffeomorphism, the things we need them to, for manifolds, and we can relate the GRT kind of 2x2 space as we move it around to each other, then that will give us a manifold representation of the perceptual space. So in the same way as before, the point in isolation is not meaningful. Instead, we take this point, we say fix 1 to map to just some point on the manifold with a standard normal distribution around it. And then if I look, say, 1 step over from short to long in that space, and then this GRT model, I see the correlation in the bivariate normal. Then essentially all I need is a smooth map that goes between those two to have everything work out nice and connect nice. So there are definitely a lot of assumptions that sort of need to be buried beneath the surface here to make this work, but that's a rough idea of how it might work. So now what we're doing is taking a real world stimulus that may have Euclidean properties, mapping it onto a perceptual manifold, and then treating the perceptual process as essentially manifold and the probability distribution on that manifold. Let's see, these are just kind of the sum of the things you need to have it work, stated very informally, so not all that usefully, but bullet points are kind of doing what I said. Silbert and Thomas have shown, they've got a paper where they demonstrate a lot of these things do work for GRT models, and you still preserve the predicted performance in the model. Okay, but this idea of taking something in an input space, mapping it onto a manifold, or sort of representing that manifold and then using a probability distribution on it, has a very similar characterization, or is very similar to a characterization of deep learning. So it's I probably should have had this slide unfold, but at the top here, one way of describing neural networks is you take something that does not have a linear decision criteria in Euclidean space. You use the weights to sort of map that or stretch that space in such a way that you can put a linear decision bound on it. So the weights are really introducing the right kind of curvature in this space. So some have posited that the reason you get good success out of these is that the things you're trying to categorize actually do sit on a manifold. And so once we move things to that right manifold, then putting the decision criteria bounds tends to be more straightforward. The example here from this paper where I grabbed some of these ideas, supposing the manifold of all the information is just the surface of this Buddha, they ran some sort of, I guess, tests on their model where they represent that latent manifold in a lower dimensional space and still can recover a lot of information about the relationships amongst the manifold. So just so that it's not confusing, this isn't like classifying things as Buddha or not. This is more like, if you've got this point and this point are two things that I want to preserve information on, I don't need to have all of this original 3D input. I can preserve some of the structure of that manifold and still recover it pretty well. They can do better with more complicated latent representations in this scary looking Buddha. But the basic idea here is that we can treat these things as manifolds and then probability distributions on them. And so again, this gives another correspondence between a model used in perception and cognitive modeling to a model that's used in more of a machine learning context. Right, so if I've got manifolds for a deep neural net and I've got a manifold for a person, in theory then I should be able to, and they're nice, get those maps in between them. And so if I can get like a push forward from a deep learning representation to a human representation or back the other direction, that gives me the information I need to be able to translate information from one space to another, which could then inform things like training, whether it's training the network or training a person about the information in the environment. Or it could give me information in terms of the best way to communicate information to an expert. And I'll give an example of this in a couple of slides. That kind of works in theory. In practice, I have no idea how difficult it will be. But I will say that a fairly simple version of this has had a lot of success over the last decade. It's also been applied to deep neural nets, but not necessarily in that case. It's this technique, representational similarity analysis. And so in this technique, basically, you take distances between pairs of things and then relate the distances in one space to another. So for example, I could take distances in terms of the neural net representation and distances in terms of, say, the GRT representation space, and then look for correlations in those distances. And that gives me information about how well those map onto each other. The original application, or maybe not the original, one of the early applications of this was looking at relationship between neural response patterns, say an fMRI, and behavioral patterns or in a model pattern. So taking, say, two images, looking at their correlation in terms of activation in brain region, and then relating that to, say, ratings of similarity. And so if there's high correlation here, we're saying that the information represented in the similarity responses is represented or has a connection to the information represented in that area of the brain. So that's kind of a more promising first step in the way we might be able to relate these two things. Critically, though, this is all about the distance between two stimuli. So we're not trying to directly map from the picture of the guy hugging his kids in neural space to the picture in behavioral space. Instead, we're looking at the mapping between the relative, sort of the similarity of the distance between these two different images in neural space and these two different images in behavioral space. And that same kind of thing can work for the more complicated things as well. And I think that kind of is a step in the direction of looking at how these differentials map between the manifolds. All right, very quickly, I'll run through one of the examples we're working towards. So this is expert skin lesion assessment. So normally when we're training novices to sort of look at skin lesions and sort of decide if this is something to worry about or get checked out, there's an algorithmic approach like ABCD method, if you're familiar with that. Look at the area, the border, color constancy, symmetry, those kinds of things. But it really is like, here's the checklist. On the other hand, dermatologists, don't necessarily follow an algorithm. They basically talk about just looking at it and sort of it looks odd, or the term ugly duckling comes up a lot. They're basically just looking at it to see if it looks weird. And so that's characterized as really they're relying on perceptual expertise. So I guess I'll come back to that. Also, relatively recently, there's been demonstrated very good success using deep nets to classify these things as either melanoma or benign nevine. And so a couple of goals of this research is one, if I've got a representation of the information represented in this very good deep neural net, as well as an expert dermatologist, I want to be able to find out if the information they use is entirely redundant, in which case, why bother with one or the other? Or to the extent that they use divergent information, we might be able to highlight that information when we're sharing information, either from the computer vision system to the dermatologist or vice versa. And so being able to map from the neural net representation of the images to the dermatologist representation allows us to kind of highlight where those differences and similarities are. And again, if we can get that manifold representation of expert dermatologists and a similar type of representation from the neural net, there's promise in that being plausible. The other valuable thing is in terms of training people. So rather than telling people to follow an algorithm, which people tend to be kind of bad about doing, whereas relatively speaking, people are very good at perceptual expertise or learning perceptual expertise, if we can highlight in a sort of novice's manifold representation what's missing, we want to be able to show them the right images to train them on that dimension. The other really valuable part about neural nets is it gives us access to a representation of the training image sets. So this melanoma project, they've got a ton of different training images. Based on the activation patterns for a training image, I can kind of characterize that image. And if I've got the mapping to the novice space, I can figure out what the right images or the right activation patterns are to highlight particular features that that person needs training on, without necessarily having a semantic description of what they need to learn. So rather than saying, oh, they need to learn more about color consistency in these skin lesions, instead I can say, well, whatever this latent dimension represented in the neural net is, they need more information about that. So I'm going to grab images from the training set that vary highly along that dimension. And then ideally, this leads to a more efficient training solution. Okay, so definitely time to wrap up for me. Broadly speaking, I just want to highlight, and hopefully it's no surprise to the groups, there's a lot of exciting research opportunities at the intersection of artificial intelligence and machine learning and cognitive modeling. Mathematical psychology as a field serves as one of the ways to bridge between these fields. because of the goal of really having quantitative representations of things. And often the models used in mathematical psychology have very close analogs in machine learning. My naive view as somebody who's not really a differential geometer, but that this language or framework gives us an opportunity to describe a lot of different models from both fields in a common language and highlights ways to connect across them. All right, so that's the talk. Unfortunately, I can't see the chat window the way I've got things set up here. So feel free to jump in and verbally ask me questions, or maybe somebody can read the chats to me as well. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Joe. I think there is one question from Greg. Greg, do you want to ask the question?
Sure. So I'm just trying to follow along the manifolds and the Buddha analogy you were showing. So when we choose a manifold for the projection into multiple dimensions, we're doing that as a way to try and understand some underlying structure that's not present and explicitly measured in the original data set, correct?
Right.
That's what the functions you choose to create that manifold hopefully will tease that out. Is that what we're looking for?
Yeah, that's right. So
by the training data?
That's right. Yeah. So the input manifold would be something that it maybe exists out there in the world, but we don't know yet. And so the idea is that through training the weights, we want to recover that manifold structure, and then those weights represent that manifold. Exactly. But yeah,
okay, so the weights are the weights assigned by a pre-chosen function, or are they just randomly generated until they, a priori?
The weights would be learned.
Learned, okay.
So yeah. So by training the network to do well on recovering the information in the environment, the goal is to have those weights converge on a representation where it preserves the manifold structure.
So emerging convergence, right? All right, based on the multi-dimensional projection and the graphing distance being the most minimal between those associations? Is that how the convergence is measured?
So I think it could be. I think in this case, the idea would be, yeah, I think in this case, they were looking at how well in that reconstructed space the distances were preserved after reconstructing it. But in general, I think there's not necessarily an explicit measure of how well distances are preserved. So if I'm categorizing an image as, say, having a face in it or not, the training is just on how well it does saying there's a face or not. But I think the idea proposed in this paper, the reason that it can land on a good solution is that, say, the manifold on which images sit, the submanifold of all of the image space, contains the information about the parts with faces and not.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I had a general question, Joe, about your exemplar theory. It could be a very naive one. So in this case, you have to look at all of your sample space, and then you're collecting the distances, right? And the distance measure could be in different forms. You've shown some ways in how you measure that distance, but just that sheer collection of all the samples, that seems like a very demanding in terms of cost. So are there other variants of it that are being considered, in a sense that just thinking of that space, that you have to work with seems like not ideal when you have
Sure.
large example spaces. So
Absolutely. So I think, let's see. Most of the applications that I'm familiar with are in fairly constrained spaces. So, for example, categorizing the rocks, the idea is that they're limiting the model to a fairly relatively constrained set of potential exemplars. So I think kind of guessing what Nosofsky would say, that it's not out of the question that all of those exemplars would still be stored and used in theory. But in terms of the model representation, I assume they implement some kind of pruning on that.
okay. Yeah, I don't know. Even within this, I could see a lot of subclasses, a lot of variants even within this rock example. But yeah, maybe in constrained setups, yes, that might be a good variant. Yeah. Are there other questions for?
I had one quick question.
Please go ahead.
If you can hear me, okay.
Yeah.
On your, so on the studies like your donut example, where the perceptual similarity between these different objects are plotted here. All you have to, there may be some underlying manifold that these lie on where blueberry is not at all close to custard. It looks close here, some kind of U-shaped manifold, like you said. But we've only given, and I think I may have missed, I assume these were collected by from some kind of survey in some kind of psychological study, but they were only, the participants were only given these 2 dimensions to work with from the beginning. So there may be some lost dimension, even if we were going to try to fit some manifold to this, maybe given more dimensions to work with, we would have seen like in the depth space, in a z-axis, we would have seen that blueberry is nowhere near custard filled or something. But that informs what we have to take into consideration when we design these types of studies, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah. So rather than going directly to placing the donuts in the 2-dimensional space, the way the students did this is they just had lots of donuts. This was just in class. It wasn't an official experiment or anything like that. It was more giving them an excuse to eat donuts on a day off. But they have little pieces of each of the donuts, and they take a little bite of the blueberry and a little bite of the custard filled, and then just write down a similarity rating. And so in the data that we have is each of the pairwise similarities. So this could sit, I think, in a dimensional space that's just 1 minus the number of donuts. So the data kind of could be embedded without loss in that higher dimensional space. So it's not a collection that we lose.
That makes sense. I misunderstood. Yeah. So you had the similarities and then fit this this representation based on the similarities. Okay. And you could have, then based on that, you could have taken those similarities and thrown them on a manifold, thrown them on a torus or whatever you want, and then gotten a totally different result. But that brings up an entirely, that's kind of a difficult question, what manifold to choose if you have some kind of data like this, which is entirely unknown.
I think for donuts, it has to be a torus.
That's just, that's obvious.
Right. So for something like donut perceptual space, there's no a priori reason that it should be on a manifold. But the alternative is we're using something like Isomap, at least we're allowing that opportunity for it to be on a manifold rather than really forcing it to be sitting in a flat space.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Houpt, for your talk today. It gives a very good perspective on how to blend these two different fields. I think this is the first of the talks of this type. It really helps the matrix researchers make these connections between both these fields. Thank you for your time. And anybody can follow up perhaps with more questions with Dr. Houpt on his email.
Please do, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I really appreciated the opportunity to speak to the group.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye.